If you want to heal a deeply fractured, economically struggling nation, you don't start by overhauling the high school testing standards
Right. You really don't.
or, passing some sweeping new economic policy. You actually start with the 4-year-olds.
Exactly.
So, welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. Today, we have an incredibly ambitious source document in front of us. It's Pakistan's 2020 Single National Curriculum for Early Childhood Care and Education.
Specifically designed for pre-1.
Right, pre-1. And our mission today is to figure out how a country attempts to cure what its own curriculum bluntly calls educational apartheid. And they're doing it by literally rewiring the brains of its toddlers.
It really is a staggering document to unpack. I mean, when
Mhm.
you look at most national education policies, they mostly focus on, what knowledge a student should acquire.
Yeah, like math, facts, or history.
Exactly. But this curriculum, however, is fundamentally about how to engineer a unified society from the ground up,
Yeah.
all under this rallying cry of one nation, one curriculum.
Which is a huge goal.
Oh, massive. And to understand the sheer scale of what they are attempting, we really have to look at the historical context the document provides.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you really can't appreciate the proposed cure without understanding the disease, right?
Definitely.
The curriculum describes a system that has been deeply, systematically fractured for decades. And we aren't just talking about, like, a slight difference in funding between school districts.
No, not at all.
We are talking about completely distinct parallel universes of education.
Yet the document actually details 4 separate streams operating at once.
Hmm.
First, you have the public sector schools, which they cater to the masses but have historically really struggled with resources.
Right.
Second, you have low-cost private schools. Parents often just scrape together money for these, hoping for, a slight edge for their kids.
Makes sense.
Then third, you have elite, highly endowed private schools. These often use international curricula and cater almost exclusively to the wealthy. And finally, running parallel to all of this, you have the madrasas.
The religious seminaries, and the numbers here in the source material are just huge. It notes that madrasas cater to the educational needs of approximately 3 million children across the country.
3 million children. That is an enormous segment of the future population completely siloed off from the other 3 streams.
Wow.
And the curriculum argues that because these 4 institutions follow totally different syllabi, operate in different languages, and use different teaching methods, they basically produce 4 different kinds of citizens.
I mean, they're essentially growing up in different worlds.
Precisely. They graduate with different worldviews, different economic potentials, and completely different approaches to civic life. The document identifies this fragmentation as the absolute primary stumbling block for the nation's social cohesion and economic mobility.
So if you are a child born into Stream A, your life trajectory is practically alien to a child born into Stream D. They might as well be living in different countries.
That's exactly the issue, which is why this 2020 curriculum represents such a massive historical consensus. The source material outlines how they brought together over 400 experts to draft this.
Over 400.
Yeah, and for the first time, this included distinguished experts from the ITMP, which is the umbrella board representing these religious seminaries.
Oh, wow.
Right. So you had those religious leaders sitting alongside provincial educational authorities, child psychologists, and international consulting bodies like Cambridge University. All of them trying to hammer out a single foundational standard for every single child in the country.
So we have this macro level, intensely political problem of uniting millions of people. But to fix it, the designers pivot sharply away from politics and go straight into the microscopic world of synapses and neurons.
They really do. The very first foundational pillar of the document relies heavily on the neuroscience of the first 1,000 days of a human's life.
Which is just fascinating.
It frames the window between conception and a child's second birthday, extending up into those pre-primary years as this fleeting, totally irreplaceable developmental window. They cite a really striking UNICEF statistic.
What is it?
In these early years, a child's brain forms 700 to 1,000 new neural connections every single second.
Every second.
Every second. It's a pace of neuroplasticity that a human being will just never experience again.
Wait, I have to push back on this framing a little bit. When you read that specific section, they draw a straight line from a 4-year-old missing out on early stimulation directly to, like, adult heart disease and crime rates.
Right, they do.
Linking a kid missing preschool to adult cardiovascular disease feels like a massive leap. Does the document actually prove causality here, or is it just using scary correlations to justify a bigger education budget?
That's a very fair critique, and the text absolutely leans into macro-level correlations rather than, individual guarantees. But their argument is based entirely on something they term the cost of inaction.
The cost of inaction.
Yeah. They are drawing from longitudinal global studies that show how early environments biologically embed themselves in a child.
Meaning, like, the environment physically alters the architecture of the brain?
Exactly. The text references how adverse early experiences, whether that's a lack of cognitive stimulation, poor nutrition, or emotional neglect, trigger toxic stress.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah. And that toxic stress floods a developing brain with cortisol. That physically inhibits those 1,000 neural connections a second from forming properly in the prefrontal cortex.
So it's actual physiological damage.
Right. So when the document links a lack of early education to future non-communicable diseases like obesity or diabetes, it's arguing that poor executive function developed at age 4 leads directly to poor impulse control and bad health choices at age 40.
Okay, that reframes the entire concept of preschool. It's not just a place to babysit kids so parents can work. The curriculum is treating these children as the nation's most vital raw infrastructure.
That's a great way to put it.
If you don't pour the foundation of a bridge correctly, the bridge collapses 20 years later under heavy traffic. They are applying that exact same engineering logic to human capital.
And that logic is why the curriculum explicitly aligns itself with global commitments. If we connect this to the bigger picture, they specifically cite the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 4.2.
Right, the SDGs.
Yeah, which mandates that by 2030, all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development and pre-primary education. They're using this neuroscience to say, look, this isn't just about teaching the alphabet. It is a macroeconomic imperative.
But if we look at the reality on the ground, that creates a really fascinating tension because on one hand, you have this hyper-modern, UN-backed neuroscientific framework.
Right.
But you can't just drop a completely Western pedagogical framework into Pakistan and expect a deeply traditional society, including those 3 million madrasa students, to suddenly adopt it.
No, it would never work.
If the curriculum doesn't deeply respect the existing culture, it'll just be rejected instantly. So how did the designers engineer a solution to that?
It's a delicate, deliberate balancing act. When we look at the key considerations outlined in the text, it explicitly roots its modern pedagogical goals in deeply traditional national foundations.
How so?
Well, it mandates that the overarching ethos be drawn from teachings from the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the practices and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
It also anchors the curriculum in the ideological vision of national founders, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the poet Allama Iqbal.
And it doesn't just leave those as vague, high-level goals, right? It actually translates them into daily classroom routines.
It does. For the religious education components, the curriculum dictates that Muslim children will learn the first kalma, which is the fundamental Islamic declaration of faith, and small daily du'as.
Those are prayers, right?
Yeah, personal prayers or supplications used in daily life, like before eating or sleeping. But what is critical is the why. The document emphasizes that they aren't just reciting these blindly. They're learning them to understand that Islam fundamentally stands for peace and harmony.
Okay, but how does it handle the non-Muslim students within this one nation framework?
The curriculum is very explicit about non-discrimination. It legally mandates that non-Muslim children will not be forced to learn Islamic studies.
Oh, that's interesting.
Instead, they will learn and practice the ethics and values of their own respective religions. The text places a massive emphasis on respecting the beliefs of all faiths, framing religious tolerance not just as a courtesy, but as an essential national value.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Because right alongside this deeply traditional religious foundation, the curriculum mandates an aggressive, complete move away from rote learning.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
It's less like upgrading a computer's software and more like trying to change the brain from a passive filing cabinet into an active processing engine.
I like that analogy.
The original cultural and religious hardware remains, but how the brain accesses and uses information is completely overhauled.
That active processing engine is exactly what they're going for. The curriculum explicitly forbids written exams for pre-1.
Wait, forbids them?
Completely forbids them. It instructs teachers that pushing children to absorb knowledge through rote memorization actually cripples their cognitive capacities. It kills their natural curiosity. Instead, the entire system pivots to play-based learning and critical thinking.
Which sounds great on paper, but how does the curriculum instruct a teacher to actually execute that? I mean, how do you teach peace and critical thinking to a room full of energetic 4-year-olds?
Right. It sounds
Yeah.
impossible. But the document translates these high-level ethical concepts into the mechanics of daily classroom behavior.
Give me an example.
So the curriculum defines peace as tolerance, respect, kindness, and love. In the classroom, this means teaching children to wait their turn for a toy. It means learning to share materials amicably and, crucially, using a problem-solving approach to resolve conflicts rather than, throwing a tantrum.
So, learning to wait your turn for the blue crayon isn't just about keeping the classroom quiet. The curriculum is framing that mundane act as the foundational civic duty required to build a harmonious society.
Exactly. It is micro-level nation building. And it's reflected in how they structure the physical classroom, too.
How so?
The document details the creation of learning corners, a reading corner, an art corner, a science block corner. During designated free play, children must choose which corner to go to, decide what to do there, and negotiate with peers who want to use the same space.
Wow.
Yeah, that constant daily practice of choice, negotiation, and self-regulation is exactly how you build executive function.
Okay, so from philosophical harmony to the actual mechanics of learning, let's talk about language. Because
Hmm.
if you have 4 different streams of education, you likely have multiple languages at play.
Oh, definitely.
How does this curriculum handle the progression of language for a child who's just learning to speak?
This is covered under the language and literacy domain, and their approach is highly strategic. It doesn't just throw every child into Urdu or English immediately. The curriculum mandates that formal education must begin in the child's mother tongue.
So, the local or regional language they already speak at home.
Exactly.
That makes total sense from a cognitive load perspective. I mean, if a child walks into a classroom and the teacher's speaking an alien language, the child's affective filter just goes up.
Oh, absolutely. They panic.
Right. They get stressed, cortisol spikes, and learning just shuts down. By starting in the mother tongue, the document is basically saying they are building self-esteem and making the school environment feel secure.
Precisely. Once that secure foundation is established in the mother tongue, the curriculum gradually introduces Urdu, the national language, and then systematically phases in English.
Okay, my understanding of phonemic awareness is that it's about breaking down the sounds of spoken words rather than just memorizing the alphabet.
Yes.
The document uses the word mat. So instead of teaching the letters M-A-T, the teacher trains the kids to hear the M sound, the A sound, and the T sound. Is that why they focus on phonemic awareness so heavily? Because it gives it a tool to decode any language.
You've hit it exactly.
Yeah.
The curriculum heavily prioritizes phonemic awareness over rote letter memorization. When children learn to manipulate those individual phonemes, they aren't just memorizing the shape of a word.
They're learning the code.
Yes, they're learning the underlying code of the language. When they encounter a completely new word, they can sound it out independently. It builds self-reliance.
And they absolutely need that cognitive flexibility because the physical mechanics of reading these languages are entirely opposed. Think about it. It's like learning to play the piano with 2 different chime signatures at once.
That really is.
Your brain has to completely compartmentalize its spatial awareness. The curriculum notes that children must be taught that Urdu is read from right to left, starting at the top right corner of the page.
Right.
But simultaneously, they are learning that English is read from left to right, starting at the top left. They both flow top to bottom, but they literally mirror each other horizontally.
It is an incredible demand on spatial reasoning. And the curriculum designers are very aware of this cognitive burden. That is why there is a strict recurring rule embedded throughout this section.
Richard.
Children must never be forced to learn beyond their capacity.
So they explicitly tell teachers to just back off if the kid isn't getting it.
Yes, exactly. The text repeatedly emphasizes that individual achievement will vary wildly at this age. It directs educators to use observation checklists and portfolios to track progress, rather than any sort of standardized testing.
That's a relief.
Yeah. If a child hasn't mastered left-to-right tracking by Tuesday, the teacher shouldn't be concerned. The curriculum prioritizes the process of inquiry over the immediate production of a correct answer.
So we have the symbolic codes of language mapped out. But a 4-year-old doesn't live in a world of abstract letters, you know? They live in a highly tangible physical world.
Very true.
How does the curriculum transition them from understanding symbols to navigating the actual society around them?
This transition happens in the domains called the world around us and basic mathematical concepts. And the goal here is to anchor all this critical thinking in tangible reality.
There is a fantastic example in the source text that illustrates exactly how they do this. To teach children about community and supply chains, the document instructs teachers not to just show a flashcard of a baker.
Right, that would be rote learning.
Exactly. Instead, they do an exercise where they trace the origin of everyday objects. They start with a piece of bread. The teacher asks the class, "Where do we get this bread from?" The kids answer, "The baker."
And then it goes deeper.
Right. Then the teacher asks, "But what is the bread made from?" Flour. "And where does the flour come from?" "The farmer who grew the wheat."
What's fascinating here is how that specific exercise builds systems thinking. It trains the brain to look past the immediate convenient object in front of them and question the entire invisible infrastructure that produced it.
It's a profound shift in worldview. I mean, by tracing bread to the flour and flour to the farmer, they aren't just learning vocabulary words, they are being taught systems thinking at age 4.
It's incredible.
They are learning to see the invisible economic webs that connect the farmer in the rural field, the driver of the transport truck, the baker in the local shop, and their own dinner table.
And importantly, the curriculum extends that understanding of invisible webs to how children view different classes of people.
Oh, we're
Yeah, the document pairs this curiosity about objects with recognizing specific community members. It explicitly lists people like cobblers, street sweepers, and milkmen, alongside more traditionally prestigious roles like doctors or engineers.
So they are actively trying to dismantle class prejudices and the stigma around manual labor before those biases can even form in a child's mind.
Exactly. The goal stated in the text is to instill a foundational respect for all social roles and the dignity of all labor. And this practical, hands-on, deeply logical approach is exactly how they tackle the math domain as well.
Right, because they don't just want children chanting numbers up to 50. The curriculum insists on introducing the concept of zero.
Which is mathematically essential, but also philosophically heavy for a toddler. I mean, understanding how to represent the concept of absence.
It is a massive cognitive leap.
It is. And to help them make that leap, they ground all mathematical concepts in daily physical examples. To teach sorting and classification, the curriculum doesn't use abstract worksheets. It suggests giving children concrete materials like red and blue beads in different sizes.
Okay.
The teacher then asks the children to sort them based on two simultaneous attributes, like color and size.
And why does that specific task matter? Why color and size?
Because sorting by two attributes forces the brain to hold multiple pieces of information at once and categorize them logically. It is the absolute bedrock of executive function and algebraic logic.
Mind-blowing.
You are teaching the brain to identify and manipulate variables. Or, another example, they suggest creating a pictograph for the class birthdays. The kids physically map out which month has the most birthdays and which has the least.
So it teaches them that math isn't just, abstract numbers on a page. It's a tool for finding patterns in the chaos of the real world.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean when we step back and look at the whole picture? We started this deep dive looking at a deeply divided nation, a society fractured into 4 separate streams of reality, from elite international schools to millions of students in traditional madrasas.
The educational apartheid.
Right. And their blueprint to fix it wasn't a superficial policy update. It was a complete dive into the neuroplasticity of the first 1,000 days of life. It's the cognitive flexibility required to read right to left and left to right simultaneously.
Yeah.
It's the empathy to respect the local street sweeper as much as the doctor, and it's the intellectual leap to trace a simple piece of bread back to the wheat field.
It raises a profound question and is the thought I want to leave everyone with today. This document frames early childhood not just as a cute educational phase, but as the single most critical window to prevent future societal collapse.
Wow.
Whether that manifests as economic dependency, chronic disease, or fractured social cohesion. If a nation's entire future trajectory is largely cemented by the architecture of a child's brain at age 5, how much of our own global potential are we leaving on the table when we dismiss early childhood education as simple daycare, rather than recognizing it as the ultimate irreplaceable tool for human development?
That is exactly the point. Building a nation's future from scratch doesn't start with pouring concrete for a new highway or drafting a trade agreement. It turns out it starts with a 4-year-old learning how to share a blue bead and realizing that the bread on their table connects them to everyone else in the country. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. Keep tracing the bread, keep looking for those invisible webs, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.